Good evening, everyone. I'm Avisa, and welcome to what it promises to be a rather fascinating and informative Uncle Bobbie's virtual author event. I'm really excited to have author Rebecca Subar here with us tonight to present and to unpack this really innovative and timely book entitled When to Talk and When to Fight, the strategic choice between dialogue and resistance. The book is to be released on August 24th, but you can pre-order your copy on the Uncle Bobbie's Bookshop website by clicking the green button below the screen. Or you could come to the store and get a signed copy. We're going to have those available shortly. So you know how we do. After the conversation, after everything's all laid out, we'll be fielding audience questions. So please feel free to submit them over the course of the conversation by using the Ask a Question module at the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, let me introduce our moderator for the evening. Amadee Braxton works to support progressive movements, policy change, and cultural transformation for a more just world by helping change organizations and coalitions, to change organizations and helping coalitions to do their work more efficiently by promoting stories and creative expression that heal and revitalize a sense of what's possible. In addition to being Rebecca's colleague at Dragonfly Partners, she chairs the board of Leeway Foundation and is the host of Solutions on WURD Radio, WURD, 96.1 FM. Please welcome Amadee Braxton. Hi, Amadee. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And now for our featured author, Rebecca Subar. She's a senior partner at Dragonfly Partners. She's a queer, white, secular Jew, a Palestine solidarity activist, and a Northwest Philadelphia resident since 1990. Everyone, Rebecca Subar.
Thank you so much, Avisa.
Welcome. I'm so excited to have you both. I'm going to let you get to it, so excuse me.
Thank you, Avisa.
Well,
Amadee,
Rebecca.
Hi. Can I say a certain thank you before we do anything, Amadee?
Sure.
I want to thank Uncle Bobbie's because this is, the first of our conversations, the launch of all of our conversations about the book. And I want to encourage people to shop at Uncle Bobbie's. If you haven't yet bought the book, or if you plan to buy it somewhere else, then I hope you buy it here at Uncle Bobbie's, Black-owned, local, wonderful bookstore with good coffee, although I'm not an expert at that. So I just wanted to make that pitch. Thank you, Amadee.
Sure. And I want to just send shout outs and greetings to everybody who's joined us tonight for this conversation. I'm super excited because I have been working with Rebecca Subar for the past 7 or 8 years and have watched you, Rebecca, find time in your very busy schedule to labor to produce this book. And it's really an amazing product. It's timely, it's useful, it's practical, it's powerful. And so congratulations on the book, your first book.
My book.
First of many.
We shall see.
We shall see. So a number of social movement organizers, strategists I know have been reaching out to me, anticipating the release of this book and saying they've either ordered their copy or they just got their copy, they're eagerly awaiting it. And people are excited because this is such a useful tool for those of us whose work is to challenge power imbalances, to build movements, to make change happen in the world. And you talk about this a little bit in the early part of your book, but like what led you, your own path and journey to kind of wanting to write this book. But tell the audience a little bit about why you wanted to write this book, what led you to write it, and who is it for?
Okay, thank you. I wanted to write it because, like a lot of us, I feel like there are two parts of me when it comes to social change. And I live in two communities of change, two really different kind of practice communities. And most of my time I spend in social movement space. What we do for a living, Amadee, obviously, is supporting social movement organizations to make the change that we need to make in order for our world to become ever more just. And then there is another world, which is where people talk with each other and try to be conciliatory, figure out how to work out problems together. And that is very close to my heart, that place. And of course, these don't always live in completely separate places, but in my life story and my life's experience, my teachers of one and my teachers of the other don't know each other. The places where I've studied one and the places where I've lived the other are completely separate from each other. And what led me to the model that you just said I've been working on all these years and working on with my colleagues like you, and I was also teaching for 14 years at Westchester. And in all this time, when we talk about conflict and when we talk about fighting and when we talk about dialogue, it's hard for us to even talk about them in one sentence. I found that it was really hard for me in graduate school 18 years ago to connect my negotiation class with Marshall Ganz's organizing class. Like, I was in these two different classes in school, and they made no sense in relation to each other. And students would take my Intro to Peace and Conflict Studies course, and some of them would say, I'm here because my brother's in the military and I want to understand war better. And other people would say, I'm here because I'm interested in dialogue. Why can't we all just get along? And these reasons had nothing to do with each other. And when I used power as an organizing principle, they began to make sense. And that's what the book does. And you asked me, who's it for?
Yes.
Do you want me to go there, or do you want to say something?
Sure. I mean, you talk about in the early part of the book in section 1, you talk about, your shorthand of the fighters or /resistors and the talkers / negotiators or dialoguers. So, and it seems like they each need the message of this book in different ways. So maybe talk about what the differences are and what the book offers both of them.
Well, the book offers each of them insights into the limitations of sticking to just one strategic approach. And, some of the people who've read the book early on or, before publication, I guess it's still before publication technically, although Uncle Bobbie's has a stack of signed copies, like Avisa said. So I'm not trying to sell the book. I'm just saying this is all new for me. So the way that I like to think about, and that if you read the book, you'll come to think about the limitations on talking, the limitations on fighting, are that there are circumstances that are predictable, that repeat themselves over and over again. And those of you who are, hardcore experienced social change activists, and those of you who are lawyers in court, and those of you who are negotiators, all know that there are limitations to the tools that you could use at one time or another. Some of the early readers have been saying, wait, are you talking about tactics? Are you talking about strategy? And they're asking me these kind of questions. What I want to say is, I'm talking about strategic approaches. I'm talking about orientations toward conflict, orientations toward problem solving. And I believe that we can solve problems in what I call column A, which is where we do our negotiation and dialogue in that realm, only when we have more or less the same amount of power as our opponent or whoever we're in conflict with. And so my dream is for people who are prone to, who are happy in the negotiating and dialogue place, to complicate that and to become more committed to seeing the power relations and noticing whether they're going to succeed or whether they're in the wrong place, and whether there needs to be fighting for power before it's possible to solve the problem together. And similarly, for those of us in social movements or in any space, we might be in a labor union, and where we are very committed to the fight. In fact, I actually pulled out a paragraph, Amadee. Can I read the fight paragraph?
Please do.
All right. Reading glasses. Here's a paragraph that describes people who, or those aspects of all of us, which are about, I'm here to fight, okay? Resist is a pronouncement aimed at potential recruits that says there's no time for the inside game. There's no time for column A, because the power difference between those calling for change and those with the keys to the change is too great. This power difference is systemic and endemic. It's built in. It requires entrenchment in a long, deep project of upending the system. Until Dr. King's giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism, along with the other begats of white supremacy and capitalism, give way to a world centered on the equality and well-being of all people, this group's mode is resistance, what I call column B. Until patriarchy too has finished its work of poisoning men and ruining the lives of women and gender nonconforming people, resistance is the daily way. Inch by inch in calm times and in bursts when public crises open the conversation wide, a fighting posture is required to flip the inequalities built into our economy, our schools, our cultures, and our mindsets. Systemic inequality requires ongoing resistance. So of course I relate to that, and many of us relate to that. And at the same time, my message to people who find themselves at home in that paragraph is to say yes, and let's be versatile enough to know that when we've won, not necessarily won forever, not necessarily won justice, flipped everything over so that everybody has enough, but won at least the campaign that we've been fighting, how do we use that power that we've consolidated in order to win more, in order to get our needs met? So that strikers, labor unions in the book are sort of the beautiful example of one place in change making where this model is sort of naturally easy to see. You strike, you're in column B, right? You're doing this power building activity. And at some point you can assess your power in relation to management. And you're like, oh, like, I think we might be able to get an okay deal. And you negotiate, you go to column A. If you have to, you go back to column B, and you go back to column A. And that kind of versatility is what I wish social change fighters and what I wish peacemaking negotiators and dialogue people.
You know, I, of course, find myself or have, you know, historically identified in the resistor fighter category. And I think as I'm reading your book and reflecting and, you know, working with you every day, but I think about, one of the reasons why I moved out of activism myself was because I was involved in a lot of groups that I think had a limited view on that resistance place, like that it was resistance for the sake of resisting. And and part of it was like a lifestyle choice. And part of it was, somebody like me who grew up never feeling like I had a lot of power. So just, not complying with the status quo and what the dominant culture was saying was my, way of being in the world. And, I found myself coming to a place of frustration of like, well, we're not being strategic. We can't just always be marching. We can't just always be protesting, or we can't just always be doing this civil disobedience. Where is it going? How do we, but the idea of actually sitting down with the people we were fighting was like anathema, like, oh, we are colluding with our enemy if we do that, but not recognizing that actually this is supposed to be building our power so that we can have the power equal to our opponent and maybe get something out of them. So I think this is such a important book for those reasons, because I know so many people feel the same way.
Amadee, two things come up for me when you say that. First is I'm like constantly wanting to like correct my message and say, oh yeah, but let's not go too far to the talking side. Wait a second. And then let's not go to the, because I have developed a distrust for any strategy, right? Any strategic approach, which is just sitting in one place and not moving. Like, to me, the strategy is not the point. The strategy can be so important. It can almost be a religion, but it isn't the end goal, right? The end goal is justice and whatever else you're trying to get. And so I just notice myself as you're talking. I'm like, yeah, but like, don't correct course, you know, like, so I that's really what the book is like saying, wait a second, it's about agility, right? The agility to go back and forth like labor union kind of people. And the other thing that came to mind is there's a story in here about a guy that a lot of people here know, but I use a fake name in the book for him. So I'll just call him Joe. Joe was a long time activist in Philly and a really strategic leader. And he was leading this big campaign for worker benefits, security guard benefits. And the escalation was, and I talk about this in the book, actually, I use him as a foil throughout the book. There were protests every week as part of this campaign, and it's building and it's building and it's building. And I had coffee with him at some point, and I was like, yo, Joe, how's the campaign? And he was like, it's good, except management wants to meet with us. And I was like, so it's good, except, like, so what's that? What's the problem with management wanting to meet with you? Is that what you were trying to get? And he was like, yeah, I want that, but I don't have a suit. And it became like a symbol in my head, you know, like, if you want to do the fighting, actually this guy has a suit, right? But he said he didn't have a suit. It sort of became this symbol in my mind for like, no, you have to have a suit ready. You have to really, it's like playing baseball. Like, if you're going to throw it, you have to like see where you're going. You have to actually believe that you're going to get there. Even if your destination is really far away, you have to keep marching up to what you've won.
Mm-hmm. And in that example, that story, all the campaigning and resisting work had actually allowed them to build enough power where the management wanted to talk to them and felt like they had to talk to them.
Exactly.
Talk a little bit about that power building cycle and just the necessity of really kind of in an ongoing way having the awareness of power relations as you're doing the social change work, and because they shift.
Absolutely.
And maybe there's an example you want to share, another example you want to share, just talk maybe more theoretically about it, whatever you want to do.
Well, here's an example that that you and I were talking about before, Amadee, that I quite like, probably because of the personalities in it. But when Barack Obama was, before he was running for president, he was in the primary, the Democratic primary, running against, among other people, John Edwards. And you'll remember, if you were of age then, that Obama was telling us how important getting health care for everybody was. And I don't know, but I'm assuming and guessing that if Obama could have left office with everybody in America having health care, everybody in the United States having health care, I'm guessing he'd have been pretty pleased with it. Well, as we know, not everybody in the United States has health care. But he would say when he was campaigning, listen, what I really want to do is I want to get everybody around the table. You know, that's like, he was all about dialogue. And he wanted to get patients, consumers of healthcare around the table, together with providers, doctors, healthcare providers of all kinds. And he wanted to get the insurance companies around the table, and he wanted to get the pharmaceutical companies around the table, and the durable medical goods. Those are the three like all controlling healthcare interests, right? And I know that there are people on this call who this is their activism, and I know you know way more about it than I do. But in that campaigning, you know, John Edwards said, "Well, I'm not actually sure that negotiation that Obama's talking about is going to work. I believe that those in the negotiation have to have more or less the same amount of power as each other in order for you to have a fighting chance of getting anything out of it. And so if federal government, federal administration wants to work together with patient groups and patient advocacy groups and provider groups, they don't necessarily have the same thing in common. They probably do have certain interests that they share, but you can actually negotiate with each other. You can figure out together what kind of plans could possibly work, whereas in what kind of economy of healthcare provision could work. But what you can't do is meet with the richest sectors of the economy, the insurance companies, the pharmaceutical companies, and makers of durable medical goods, and expect that you're actually going to get a healthcare system in the United States that's going to work for everybody. It won't. And Edwards was saying, no, that's not what you do. You gather, you then build the political power and the political will so that at some point you have more power than those powers that be. And you you start by negotiating small, and yet you're in column A, and that's say we're building power in column B at the same time as we're negotiating in column A. And we won't negotiate, we won't go to column A with those very strong powers ever, unless they become something different, unless their nature changes, unless our power grows. And then we'll be very happy to negotiate. And if they never lose their power, we're going to do something else, Amadee. We're going to go to column C. Column C looks like column B. But you know how A is the problem-solving place where the union fights for more power in column B, and when they get it, they go problem solve with management in column A. Column C looks like column B, it's fighting, but it produces what column A produces. It produces a solution. It just produces a solution that you make yourself, a solution that you don't need cooperation for. So column A is a joint consensual approach. Column B is a unilateral, non-consensual power-building approach, and column C is unilateral power building for the sake of vanquishing the other, not for the sake of ever problem-solving jointly. So that's a little bit of the story of how they work together.
And so just to break it down a little bit, John Edwards was saying you can't have the most powerful forces in the medical system at the table yet, because they have too much power. They control the status quo of the system as it is now.
Yes.
The consumers, the people who need the healthcare have less power right now.
Yeah.
And that's who, you know, and maybe the medical professionals who work in healthcare and, you know, the doctors and nurses and everything. Those are the people you have to organize first and figure out what they want.
Exactly.
And build enough power and consensus and public support for their needs and interests before you go to the negotiating table, column A activity with those powerful forces of the medical industries.
Right. And then, as you talked about before, you alluded to, Amadee, the fact that, you know, what the book is about is sort of two things juxtaposed against each other. One is, here's a new model. Here's language that you're hearing. This is a way of talking about changes that many of us are involved in making. All of us observe if we don't produce it ourselves. And then also, it is meant to be some material that challenges the way that the groups that we are part of think about these strategies. So besides descriptive language that helps us talk with each other, regardless of what our strategic approach is, it's also about the biases and the sort of inclinations that we have, either the principles, the dispositions and inclinations and biases that we bring to our choices, right? like for many of us, our strategic, our change-making home is with a group of people who support each other to be in resistance. And that's that's like the paragraph that I read. It's like, if you've read the book, Chris Hedges' War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. It's like, yes, and being in social movements is a place that gives us meaning. And sometimes it's a betrayal to negotiate. And I see some of the names of people, who are participating today. And, I know I've had conversations, or we've worked with different ones of you at different times about how difficult it can be socially and in terms of our own identity to make a decision to, let's say, negotiate with our opponents. In the book, I talk about how this old feminist named Andrea Dworkin was quite well known in feminist resistance in the, 70s, 80s, 70s, was working against pornography. Wow, was this another time? And it was before my time. And she was sort of famously working in coalition with a bunch of Christian, right, anti-pornography people. And it was very controversial in feminist movement. And so there were a lot of things going on there, but a lot of the criticism was you don't negotiate with people, right? And so that's part of it too. It's like, what's your inclination? I don't know what the right answer is, but I do know that it's really important to be able to peel back my own inclinations and sort of comfort zone and my own white middle class background in my family, grandchild of immigrants, where it was really important to be polite. It was really important to do the right thing and not get in trouble. So
self-awareness of one's proclivities or one's predisposition or tendency or bias to one way of being or another is very helpful to know as you enter into these kinds of fights or negotiations or whatever it is, or whatever the struggle that you're in, so that you can have that self-awareness as you make the choices that you need to make going forward. You talk about, so that's one of the factors that influences the choice to talk or fight. What are the other factors? You talk about principle, biases, power. Maybe you could focus on one. And then I want to just go back to the column A, B, and C and maybe talk about column C a little bit more.
I'd love to.
But first, what do you want to say about the other factors in that one needs to consider in terms of making those strategic choices of choosing to fight or talk?
Yeah. So in the book, I observed that there are 4 factors, as you just said. One of them is the balance of power, which generally speaking is our primary strategic signal of whether to talk or fight. Generally speaking, we don't have enough power, we fight. We have the power to be able to negotiate, we negotiate. It's obviously more complex than that, and I have a chapter defining power and another chapter about currencies of power. What are we talking about? What is power? What is power, right? So we talk about that. But that is number one. That is like the master of strategic decision making. But there is a second fact, and these are factors that I think people groups, and this is most about groups. These are factors that groups do use. Now, how you use them, whether you should use them, those are all questions that I deal with in the book too. But the question here is, when we observe people making these strategic choices, what are they basing those choices on? So number one, they're basing them on their analysis of power. Smart strategists, we look out there and we see somebody fighting. We assume that they're a smart strategist. That's the first thing we assume before we decide that they're a terrible strategist. And if we believe them to be a smart strategist, then we can say they're fighting because they perceive that there isn't enough power to achieve their goals, right? And it may be that they're negotiating, and we can conclude, we want to say, oh, they're probably smart negotiators, they're smart dialogue people. They're probably in dialogue with their opponents. That they probably have steered their conflict into dialogue. What a beautiful thing, because they more or less have the same power. Now, that's not necessarily true, because there's a second factor that comes into play here, which is structural barriers. Structural barriers are stuff that's beyond the control of the group that prevents the group from making choices based primarily on power. So an example of that is the group that is the group that we're thinking about is in prison. It's a group of people who are in prison, and they want to acquire some kind of rights. They want to be able to have exercise time. They want to be able to appeal their cases. They want to be able to rip down the prison walls. Whatever it is that they want, by definition, there are certain limitations on their strategy. For example, there are iron bars on their cages. That's a structural barrier in the most literal way. But structural barriers exist in lots of other ways too. Well, I'll just say that, like, if you're a Palestinian living on the West Bank, and the Israeli occupation is the people in charge, then there are certain things that you can only do if the risks to you are so great. Certain kinds of movement, certain kinds of, especially going to a place where you're not invited or you're prohibited to go, you can be risking your life. And that's a kind of structural barrier that, in fact, makes many Palestinians and Israeli Jews have dialogue with each other, right? Because it may be that ideally you would be doing power building protests of whatever kind, but your choice is actually to do dialogue. And so when you see someone doing dialogue, it may not be, oh, you have the same amount of power. It may be, you wish you could be fighting, but you don't think you can be. Mm-hmm. Probably that doesn't permit you to get your needs met, but it is an explanation for the choices people make. So that's power, and that's structural barriers, which include capitalism and racism and sexism and ableism and all of the structures that prevent us from having the money and the race privilege and the class privilege and the ability privilege of every kind, all of the uprankings that allow a person to have power, right? So those two things. Now, what's number three? Number three is principle. We can see, let's say that they're, let's say Quakers. I'm looking at who's here. I don't know. Can't tell for sure, but I suspect there are probably a whole good bunch of Quakers on here, Amadee.
If we're in Philly, there's got to be Quakers in the room.
Got to be. So you could be against injustice and also against fighting, and that puts you in kind of a bind, right? That's tricky because, like Martin Luther King Jr., in his letter from a Birmingham jail, which many people on the call will be familiar with, he's writing this from jail where he was arrested for civil disobedience, 1963, and he writes this letter saying, hey, listen, this letter is to my opponents. This letter is to a bunch of white pastors who are complaining about the fact that I did this direct action, that I've been actually subjected myself to great risk and disobeyed laws that I thought were unjust. I know you think that's not okay. And you want me to negotiate. And the fact is, I want to negotiate. I think that's how we win. But I have no business negotiating as long as we don't have power. So that is a teaching that I have taken, right? To be like, oh, right, let me understand the civil rights era in these terms. That is him saying, these are my principles. That is him saying, my principles are that I'm going to do nonviolent resistance. That's the kind of resistance I can tolerate and condone. And I can't do what's strategically unacceptable. I can't talk when I know that talking won't get us what we need to get, because that's against my principles. And the white pastors who had written him, who he was responding to, were like, we can't violate our principles, right? We can't violate our principles that we have to talk. Now, that leads us to the fourth factor, which is our proclivities and what's the D word that I said before?
Disposition.
Our dispositions. Our dispositions, our proclivities, our tendencies, our preferences, our biases toward one thing or another. I have this chart on my wall, which is like 300 biases that are part of our, and all those kind of social biases, those pastors had, so we all have biases, right? I happen to think that one of the reasons why King and Gandhi and some less famous activists and many of you on this call are sort of well-known, well-regarded strategists, is because you're able to nimbly move back and forth between column A and column B. And we want to get to column C, but that's what King was modeling. And he just said it really beautifully, which is why he gets to be in the book. And only some of you get to be in the book. But so this fourth factor is bias, and bias is so strong. And I'll just say, see above, when I was talking about how we stick with communities of our choice, and we stick with what we were raised with, and sort of what our class backgrounds and our community identities, what all those sort of press us toward. That's the fourth factor. So power, structural barriers, principle, and biases.
Two things came up for me as you were talking just now,
Yeah.
describing these factors. One, the person who has the suit maybe is middle class, upper middle class, and feels more comfortable in a room with powerful people who also wear suits. That's a comfort zone for them, whereas maybe their person in their group who comes from a working class background and maybe doesn't have experience in those kinds of class strata, circle, or space, would not feel comfortable engaging in that kind of activity. So that's one thing that came to mind. And then the other, in terms of structural barriers, this comes from my own experience, being involved in, I think this was around doing criminal justice reform activism in the early 2000s. But being in a mixed race group with white activists and black activists, and the white activists wanting to do a sit-in in front of the police station, and the black activists, at least some of us, saying, we're not going to do that. If we get arrested, we're going to be treated differently than when you get arrested, and like, that's a barrier for us that we're not willing to cross. And that's just kind of that popped into my, I hadn't thought about that experience in so long, and it pissed me off at the time and led to some strife within our group, because I was like, you guys are totally ignorant to the fact that this structural barrier exists for the black people that you're in this struggle with.
That's what I'm
yeah. So let's talk about column C, because I think this is a really interesting space. So column A is the space of talking and negotiating once you have enough power. Column B is the power building space where all the activities that you do, whether it be boycotting or street protest or whatever, all the ways that we fight and resist, right, could be violent, but all the things we do to resist to ostensibly build the power that we need to do to sit down and negotiate in column A for what we want. But so talk about what is column C and why that's interesting and important.
All right, column C. Let's talk about that. You know what I was thinking about? An example. Do you remember Bree Newsom from North Carolina?
Yes.
The activist who, I guess,
South Carolina, I think.
South Carolina.
I don't know. I can't remember anything these days. COVID.
Who knows? You can put it in the chat. Bree Newsom, South or North Carolina. Oh, come on, people. Anyway,
she climbed up the flagpole.
She climbed up the flagpole. Now, she did not ask this was not joint consensual activity. She climbed up the flagpole where there was a Confederate flag, and she was at the State House of Carolina. gosh, we are so talking like Yankees.
South Carolina, somebody put in.
Okay, thank you. Oh no!
Oh, north. Oh, okay.
South, north.
We'll get it straight. Anyway,
Funny.
she climbed up the flagpole.
Conflict. She climbed up the flag because it was a Confederate flag, and she's like, "I'm going to take it down." Now, she's saying, is she going in there and saying, "Hey, let's talk about the flag"? Now, countless people have tried to get any state that still has a Confederate flag flying above their right Confederate flag, 10 Commandments. There have been umpteen conversations, negotiations, attempts at legislation, right? But here is a person who at some point in the struggle, in the movement for Black Lives, round 1, 5-7 years ago, says, this is not going to be a power building moment. Of course, it has the side effect of building power. But she's saying, and we imagined a group of people, but she is saying, I'm going to unilaterally solve the problem here. I'm not doing this in order to build power to do another thing. Of course, in effect, I'm also building, we are building the power of the movement. But right now, I'm solving a problem. I'm solving a problem, which is there is a Confederate flag over the State House. And that itself is a racist thing that I have the ability to resolve. Right now, I'm going to go do it. I'm just going to go do it. And, you asked before, Amadee, about the dynamics of column C, and they're pretty interesting because on one hand, you can be the liberator, which is the name that I give someone who does what Bree Newsom did. But if you have more power than the other, and you still continue to use resistance and power building tactics, in other words, power-oriented tactics to try to keep yourself having more power, either the same or even more power than the other, I have a name for you too. You become a tyrant, right? And so that's about a strategic and just way to use unilateral, non-consensual power vanquishing, right? So you can be the occupying force, a military occupying force, and want to continue, keep your troops in Iraq, in the Holy Land, the West Bank. You can want to keep your foot in Gaza. You can want to keep your forces there, but you have more power than the other. You're in column C, but you are in an incorrect place in column C, a non-strategic, unjust place in column C. You're a tyrant because you are a character in the story in the book. You are a character who has more power and yet is orienting yourself to vanquish the power of the other. Yuck. Mm-hmm. So there's a place in the book. In fact, you sort of like study these 4 factors and how groups make decisions, right? And then you study these columns, and then you get to, and there's stories about the column, and then you get to this place toward the end of the book where we're like, oh, if you're in a place where you have about the same amount of power as someone else, and you're still fighting, we'll call you the perennial fighter. Well, it's not strategic. If, on the other hand,
it's tiring. It's tiring to be the perennial fighter. That's where activist burnout comes from.
Oh my God, that's so good, Amadee. That is so good.
I've been there. I've lived
there. I know, but that's the sequel. Is like because all the humane stuff that you and other people who are more humanely oriented, as opposed to the theorist here, no, that's how we do it. Yes, that's where burnout happens. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
I want to just pause for a minute, and you can wrap up your thought, but I want to invite people to put some questions in the chat, and our esteemed author, will answer those questions. I think there was maybe a question earlier. I can scroll back up, but do you want to finish your last thought before we go to questions?
Well, I guess I was just wrapping that thought up, that like toward the end of the book, I share with the reader the sort of like attention, ATTEN, attention to like what happens when you look at, like, what are you looking at when you look at someone who's burnt out? What are you looking at when you look at someone who's like always having lovely conversations with someone, or maybe not lovely, but they're in difficult dialogues with someone, and nothing seems to change, right? So you might question what the power relations are, and you might find that one group has quite a bit less power than the other, and there they are in column A with asymmetric power. And what we call this character, the downrank character, is the sacrificial lamb, you know. And what we call this character is the wolf in sheep's clothing, right? Because these are characters they're not, you know, now if they had the same power, we would call them the problem solvers. So we're sort of like identifying errors where groups make choices that are erroneous. And I think we're getting questions also in the chat.
Yeah, we're getting questions, and also if people have comments that they would like to offer as well, we have a few minutes to do this. So I saw one question from JD Davids. Hi, JD. There's been a lot of examples in the past year and a half of not having enough power to overcome harmful COVID-era policies of the state or any standing to negotiate. For example, here in New York City, it has been all but impossible to change anything that the mayor or governor is doing, pending hopeful impeachment or resignation notwithstanding of your governor. What is working in the here and now so we can become more powerful in this very hard era? It's easy to, you know, it's harder when we're in a global pandemic kind of health crisis moment that can be used to kind of supersede everything in terms of people's struggle, grassroots struggle. What do you think, Susan?
I think structural barrier, right? So it's a structural barrier that prevents us from building power in the way that we want to. And it forces us to do things that are not the most strategic. And JD Davids, you're one of my greatest teachers on strategy, so you tell me. But column C looks very tempting. And that's what impeachment is, right? And that's why we're driven to go to column C. Right? Because and that's where revolution is. And that's where liberation is, because, and I don't mean liberation isn't in column B to column A, it is. But what I call the liberator I call Bree Newsom liberator, right? It's like, okay, I can see that I'm dealing with Donald Trump / Hitler. Those are my shorthands for someone I'm never going to negotiate with. And it may be that this is someone who, under certain circumstances, I could negotiate with, but those circumstances are behind structural barriers that's very unrealistic for me to think are ever going to go away. So my group makes a judgment, right? Is this the time of last resort when we go to column C? It's a difficult choice. We have to measure power. We have to assess the environment. We have to consider all kinds of factors. And if we believe that it's reasonable to think there never will be circumstances under which we can have a negotiated, I don't mean just to talk, but like use existing systems to, you know, consensually resolve these issues together, we're going to go to column C. And it might not be easy and it might not be possible. And this is where I have the Andra Day quote. You know the song? Oh, I can't remember the lyrics right now, but I know you all know it. Rise Up, right? The song where she talks about just rising up another day is sometimes all we can do. and that becomes an act of resistance. And we're used to saying that, right? We're used to, in social movement spaces, we're used to saying, oh, it's resistance just to live my life, just to have joy, right? And I learned this from people of color. I learned this specifically from women of color, queers of color. Like, that's what we do, right? And I hear that, and I learn from that. And I see, and I, at first, like me, a middle-class white person, queer and all that, but like, I didn't understand that at first. I didn't understand what it meant, that just living your life is like the best form of resistance kind of thing. But that's, I think, a meaning of it, is that sometimes all these forces are against us. And the model in the book does call such a situation where even column C becomes impossible. I mean, you're in column C, but a solution becomes elusive. We call that something with the D, not A, B, or C, but something with the D. And the illustrator of the book, the illustrious Rosie Greenberg, I don't know if you're on here, but my amazing colleague in thought and in art. She's not my colleague in art, she's my master in art. Rosie invented the dumpster fire. And that's what we're dealing with.
We're dealing with the dumpster fire. I would also add, and maybe this is my book, who knows, but there is the power, and this is in the Bree Newsome example, there is the power of culture and the power of cultural, there's the power of culture to make change. Symbolism is a powerful kind of seeding, seeding, of ground when you're in this kind of moment where it's a dumpster fire and there's not a lot of options strategically, but you can do some symbolic resistance, public symbolic resistance, to try to get the message out, shift consciousness, and prepare us for when the time is right to take action. So that,
and doesn't that build the movement too?
Yeah,
right.
That is a kind of power building, even though it's not, maybe feels less tangible, but I think it's an often overlooked area.
Yes.
But sounds like a nice, this maybe is a nice invitation to have a strategy conversation with JD. Okay, I see a couple other questions.
And Rosie, the illustrator, is saying hi.
Oh, cool.
Hi, Rosie. Shout out to you and your amazing graphics. Can I show one, Amadee? Just like,
sure.
Okay, what I want to share is, remember I told you about the tyrant? Remember I told you about the wolf in sheep's clothing? Remember I told you all about that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is what you'll see.
What page is that?
This is on page 125. Is it backwards in this thing?
No, it's not.
Okay.
Encyclopedia of Social Change Characters.
Yeah. So you can see that if you're in column A, but you have more power, you're a wolf in sheep's clothing, that sort of thing.
That's at the top.
Find yourself here. The resistance. Problem solvers. Yay! Yeah, all that.
Cool. Now the illustrations in the book are amazing.
They're amazing. Rosie?
All right, we have a couple more questions. How can you, this is from Deborah, how can you judge when you have an equal and necessary level of power, especially when you are in a conditional, historical, powerless mindset / status?
Can you say that again? Because I was distracted by JD Davids, who, shout out to JD, who has just posted some brilliant reads. Read them here. Sorry, Amadee. Can you say that
intervention? Yeah, so this is from Deborah. How can you judge when you have an equal and necessary level of power, I'm assuming to go into column A activity, especially when you are in a conditioned, historical, powerless mindset / status?
Deborah as in Z? Deborah Zubo? Is that who that was? I think it was.
Yes.
Hi, Z. Two points about that. One is, how do you measure power? And the other one is, how do you shake your enough to change your mindset? And I hear you asking those two questions. And indeed, sometimes one's harder. Usually the second one's harder. So, I have 2 chapters in the book that are about how you make that determination. But the good news is that you don't have to actually have there's a place where I go into like how Pokemon characters measure their power. It's really cool to be a Pokemon, because Pokemon characters have like objectively measurable power. They have these like dots and character traits and stuff like that. And you can just like measure which one has more power. And there's also something called a secret power calculator or something like that. And I'm pretty sure, even though I'm not a Dungeons and Dragons person, that like, I don't know, Daniel Park, if you're on here, but you were gonna like coach me on this, that D&D has all these like objective ways of measuring power also. Well, that's amazing. And we don't have that. And so we have to have alternatives. So I set up series of questions in order to answer. You don't really need to know how much power you have measured in spoons or rubles or, money in order to be able to ask the question, do I have a sufficient amount of power to make it worthy to negotiate? So it's relative power that we're asking about. And relative power isn't even necessarily in the same currency. So when we talk in the book, I talk a lot about how you have institutions have power that is sometimes measurable in money, but it can also be measurable in the in structural currencies, right? So you're white, you have all this inherent power. You are the bank president, you have all this power. You're Christian, you have certain power. Now, you might be Black and Christian and have way less power than a white secular Jew. But all these currencies taken together can help us understand who has sort of like structural power. And then there are these currencies of power like money and stuff and books and knowledge that you might learn in school that you can accumulate, and you can accumulate more of. And then there's potential power, which is what we mobilize. And social movements, for example, have that potential power. It's never, by definition, institutional power that sticks forever, but it's this potential power. And so the ways that you can measure the potential power against these structural power and other currencies of power is just to ask a series of questions that'll help us to know whether or not it makes sense, whether or not we have a fighting chance, whether or not we have a chance of getting our interests minimally met, at least at the negotiation table. So in short, my answer is there's a secret code for figuring that out. But it involves a whole bunch of definitions and stuff like that. It's in the book.
And then buy the book to understand the code.
Yeah, understand the code.
And then Rebecca, I'm sorry to cut you. We have one more minute, and there's a really important question that I want to get to. Can you come back from column C to column A, and under what circumstances might you want to or need to?
You can come back from column C to column A. It's a different kind of move, right? So you can, for example, be working against fossil fuel, against carbon being taken out of the ground and messing with our climate. And you can be fighting, and I know that there's some illustrious fossil fuel fighters on this call too. And if you vanquish the fossil fuel industry, you may do that by making all of the people who are invested in fossil fuel industry sad and poor and hungry. But you may also do it by creating alternatives and renewables and stuff like that, renewable industry, and making it possible for all of them to exit the fossil fuel industry and go to work somewhere else. And then you can, you've neutralized their power. And in a separate action, in a separate set of campaigns, one of the questions that emerges here, are you in conflict with them? And you aren't, right? Because if you vanquished somebody, then you have the keys, and the keys are really important here. You vanquish them, you've taken the keys away from them. But it could be that your opponent has other power. It's true that they're no longer working in the fossil fuel industry, but they've taken their marbles somewhere else. And it may be that you have enough power because everybody knows that you're the people that put fossil fuels back in the ground. And so that you've got enough power, you've mobilized enough power that you can actually negotiate with them. So that's a way that you move from sleep back down.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. This was a teaser.
Amadee, thank you so much to you, my amazing colleague and friend, and listen to Solutions on WURD on Friday nights from 5 to 7 at something AM, which I can't remember.
900 AM, 96.1 FM.
All right.
But enough about me. And I'm sorry we didn't get to answer every question.
Thank you, Z, for asking the question. Yes. Oh,
I think you're on mute.
We long to hear you. You're saying thank you. We can read your lips, but we can't hear your voice. What's happening? What's happening? Yes, Amanda says, thank you. Uncle Bobbie's. Click the green box. Order your book from Uncle Bobbie's. Patronize Black-owned business in Germantown.
Avisa's having some sound issues and she doesn't know what to do, but I can read lips. I didn't know I could read lips well, but I'll just say thank you to Uncle Bobbie's for hosting this. Thank you, Avisa, for setting up everything. Thank you, Rebecca, for writing this wonderful book that I think is going to really become a manual for people. And thank you for being my work partner too, because this is really fun for me to be able to talk in this way about the work. We do this on a practical day-to-day basis with our clients, thinking about these things, but it's really great to kind of take a step back and dig in new ways. So,
well, I love doing this work with you, Amadee.
So thank you, and thank you everybody who came to support.
Is this working now?
Yes. Okay, go ahead, Avisa. We're just filling in time.
This was really a great conversation. I feel like we just scratched the surface, but this is great because now everyone else knows what to do. Come out and get the book, come to the store and get our copy or order it. This is just what a great tool for what I hope will be the movers and the builders, the movement builders of tomorrow. So thank you so much. Thank you, Rebecca Subar, and thank you, Amadee Braxton, for being with us. I look forward to knowing what this book is gonna do for the rest of the year and for all of us out here trying to get moving.
Thank you, Avisa.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Have a great night, everyone. Thanks for
coming. Night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.